torches burned low along the stone path leading to the great hall. Hundreds of wolves stood shoulder to shoulder in the forest clearing, their breath rising in thin white clouds beneath the crescent moon. Not a single voice broke the silence. Not a single foot shifted on the frost-hardened earth. The sacred drum had stopped. The ritual candles had been lit. And the crested coffin of Alpha Walter Dillon, the most revered patriarch the Iron Veil Pack had seen in 3 generations, rested at the center of it all, draped in wolf-grey linen and sealed with his bloodline crest in polished iron. It was a night for mourning. It was a night for honoring. And then the doors to the sacred hall opened. A hush fell even deeper than the one already there. Alpha Eric Hanson walked in. His fur cloak swept behind him. His ceremonial armor caught the torchlight. While his jaw was set and his expression was practiced into something between grief and authority, the face of a man who had rehearsed his entrance and found it satisfying. But it was not his face that made the entire pack go still. It was the woman beside him. She wore red. A deep, deliberate, impossibly red gown cut to display her very visible, very rounded belly. Her blonde hair fell in loose waves over a fur-lined wrap. Her hand rested on her stomach, the way a woman rests her hand on something she wants the whole room to see. And Alpha Eric's hand covered hers. Not privately, not gently, but openly, publicly, like a declaration. Karen Preston had not been invited to this funeral, and yet there she stood, at the Alpha's side, inside the most sacred ceremony the Iron Veil Pack observed, and smiling as though she had already won something. The whispers started at the back and moved like wind through dry leaves, as every single eye in that hall then moved to the woman standing on the opposite side of the coffin. Tiffany Hanson, Luna of the Iron Veil Pack, mate of the Alpha, daughter-in-law of the man in the coffin. She stood in ceremonial black, a fitted gown with fur-trimmed shoulders, silver moon-crest jewelry at her throat, her braided blonde hair coiled with restrained elegance. Her posture was perfect. Her hands were folded. Her expression was unreadable in the most unsettling way. Not blank, not broken, but composed in the particular way that only comes when a person has already made peace with something everyone else is only just discovering. She did not look at Eric. She did not look at Karen. Her eyes stayed on the coffin. Some assumed she was too devastated to react. Others assumed she was simply too defeated. A few of the elders exchanged quiet glances that held a different kind of knowledge entirely. What no one in that hall knew, not Eric, not Karen, but not the warriors lining the walls, was that 3 weeks before this night, Alpha Walter Dillon had summoned his family lawyer and made a decision that would rewrite everything. The sacred lands of the Iron Veil Pack, every acre of the territory, the financial reserves held in the Pack Trust, and the ceremonial authority of the bloodline had already been transferred, legally, irrevocably, under Moon law, to Tiffany Hanson. That Eric had walked into this funeral believing he was the most powerful person in the room. He was about to discover that the woman standing quietly beside his father's coffin held more legal authority over this land than he had ever possessed. This was not the moment of her humiliation. This was the moment of his irreversible exposure. Hey, quick question. How are you feeling right now? Thank you so much for being here. It really means the world to me. It is essential that we get your support through subscriptions, likes, and comments. So if this story is already pulling at your heart, please hit that subscribe button for us, smash the like, and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. It helps more than you know. All right, thank you. Now let's get back to the story. 3 years. That was how long Tiffany Hanson had been the Luna of the Iron Veil Pack, and in those 3 years, that she had learned that silence was not the same as weakness. It just looked that way from the outside, which was, she had come to understand, actually quite useful. She had arrived in this pack as a young woman from the Ashbourne line, a smaller, quieter bloodline with deep roots but no loud reputation. Eric had chosen her, or so everyone believed. The truth, which she only came to understand much later, was that Walter Dillon had guided that choice with careful intention. "He saw something in you before you saw it in yourself," her late father-in-law had told her once, during one of their quiet evening conversations in his study. Walter had a way of speaking that always sounded like ordinary conversation, until you sat with it afterward and realized it had been instruction. She had loved him like a father. Genuinely. Not for his position or his power or his land, but for the way he treated her like a person whose opinions had weight, whose concerns deserved answers, and whose dignity was not negotiable. Eric had not shared his father's philosophy. It had not always been that way. In the beginning, there had been warmth between them. Real warmth, the kind that makes a person believe in the life they are building. Eric had been attentive and even tender in those early months. He brought her wildflowers from the eastern ridge. He asked her opinion on pack decisions, even when he did not always take her counsel. He reached for her hand in public, the way a man does when he wants the world to know someone belongs beside him. Then the ambitions had grown the way ambitions do in men who are praised without limit. The warriors called him unstoppable. The council deferred to him without question. And somewhere between the praise and the power, Eric stopped seeing Tiffany as a partner and started seeing her as a fixture, one that required no particular maintenance as long as it remained in place. She noticed the shift before he did, or that was the particular cruelty of being an observant person, married to an unobservant one. Karen Preston had appeared on the edges of pack life about 18 months ago. She was from the Draven line, distantly related to a merchant family, and she had found reasons to be wherever Eric was with an efficiency that Tiffany found almost impressive in its transparency. Eric found it flattering. "You are imagining things," he had told Tiffany the first time she raised the subject, his voice carrying that particular dismissive patience that suggested she was the problem for noticing. "Karen is part of the trading council. I interact with traders. That is not a scandal." "I did not say it was a scandal," Tiffany had replied. "I said I was uncomfortable." "Then manage your discomfort," he had said, and returned to his documents. She had managed it, quietly, carefully, and in the managing of it, she had also started keeping records. Not out of spite. Not even out of strategy, not at first. She kept records because she was a precise person by nature, and precision, when applied to emotional survival, tends to look a great deal like preparation. She wrote down dates, amounts, decisions. She documented every time pack financial reserves were accessed without council approval. She noted every meeting that should have had a Luna's signature and did not. She kept copies of correspondence. She saved nothing dramatic, no angry letters, no screaming arguments, just facts. Clean, time-stamped, legally coherent facts. She said nothing to Eric, not because she was afraid, but because she understood that the moment she revealed what she knew, she lost the advantage. The moment someone realizes they are being documented, they start editing. So she waited. Patience, Walter had told her once, is not passive. It is the most active discipline a person can practice, but it means choosing not to act until the moment your action will matter most. She had chosen well. Eric Hanson had never been particularly interested in self-examination. It is difficult to develop that interest when every room you walk into rearranges itself around you. Warriors straighten at your approach. Elders wait for your word before offering their own. The packland seems to respond to your authority like a living thing that recognizes its master. But he was broad-shouldered and physically imposing in the way that comes from genuine strength rather than cultivated appearance. His braided warrior hair was dark and always slightly disheveled, as though he had just come from somewhere important. The scar running from his left jaw toward his cheekbone, earned in a border dispute 6 years prior, gave him an edge he was aware of and quietly proud of. People took a man with a scar more seriously. That had been his experience. He had been a capable alpha in many respects. He understood territorial defense. He knew how to negotiate from a position of strength. His warriors were loyal, and that loyalty had been fairly earned through years of training alongside them. But capability in one direction had always made him careless in others. The financial reserves of the Iron Veil Pack were substantial. Walter Dillon had spent 4 decades building them into something that could sustain the pack through drought, conflict, or crisis without requiring outside alliance. They were held in trust under Moon Law, which meant that withdrawals above a certain threshold required the dual signature of both Alpha and Luna, or the authorization of the Elder Council. Eric had found this inconvenient. He had, over the past 14 months, authorized 7 withdrawals above the threshold, using documentation that carried Tiffany's signature. The problem was that Tiffany had not signed any of them. She had kept the originals, and every transaction had a corresponding entry in the quiet record she had been maintaining. Eric did not know this. What he knew was that the pack finances were accessible when he needed them, that his business ventures with the Draven trading family had been generously funded, and that no one had yet raised a formal objection. Karen herself was a different kind of problem, though Eric had not begun to understand her as one. He understood her as a reward. She told him he was extraordinary. She told him a man of his strength deserved more than a Luna who maintained emotional distance. She told him his child would carry the pack forward and give the Iron Veil bloodline the future it deserved. She said nothing, at any point, about Moon Law. Moon Law, as it applied to heir legitimacy within the Iron Veil Pack, was straightforward. A child born outside the mate bond carried no automatic hereditary claim to territorial authority. This claim required Elder Council ratification and Luna authorization. Tiffany still held full ceremonial standing as the legitimate mate. Eric had either not reviewed this law recently or had decided it was unlikely to be enforced. "She'll be fine," he had said to Karen the week before the funeral. "She understands how things are. She's always been quiet about everything." "Quiet isn't the same as accepting," Karen had replied, with considerably more insight than she received credit for. "What in this case it is," Eric had said, and that had been the end of the conversation. He was wrong, of course, but he would not understand how wrong for another 8 days. Walter Dillon had always been a patient man. He had needed to be. Building the Iron Veil Pack from a fractured mid-sized territory into one of the most respected packs in the region had required decades of careful, unglamorous work. Negotiating old grievances, establishing financial discipline, reinforcing cultural traditions that gave the pack an identity worth protecting. None of it had been fast. None of it had been loud. And almost none of it had come from force alone. "The loudest thing in a room is rarely the most important thing," he used to say. "Watch what does not move when everything else is moving. That is where the real structure is." He had applied this philosophy to every area of his life, including his children. He had 3 sons. 2 had left the pack for other territories, which he accepted with grace. Eric had stayed, had shown ability, had eventually earned the Alpha title through legitimate succession. Walter had been proud of that, genuinely. But he had also been watching. He had been watching for a long time. The financial irregularities had come to his attention 14 months before his death, while when Donald Clark, the pack's family lawyer, and a man who had served the Dillon bloodline for 3 decades, brought a discrepancy to Walter's attention during a routine review of the pack trust accounts. Walter reviewed the records himself. He said nothing to Eric. He then called Tiffany to his study, closed the door, poured 2 cups of tea, and looked at her for a long moment before speaking. "Tell me what you have noticed," he said. "I need to know what you know first," she replied, startled so that I do not accidentally tell you less than the truth. He had smiled at that. A real smile, the kind he rarely showed in public, the kind that meant he had found something he was looking for. She told him everything, every date, every amount, every document she had quietly preserved. She did not dramatize it. She did not cry. though there was a particular steadiness in her voice that he recognized as the sound of someone who had already done their grieving privately and was now operating from a place of clear intention. He listened without interruption. When she finished, he sat quietly for a moment, and then said the thing that changed everything. "I am going to protect you. Not because you are my son's wife, because you are Tiffany, and you have done nothing wrong, and you deserve to have someone in this family treat you accordingly." She did not break down, which surprised him slightly. She simply nodded and then said, "What do we do?" What they did had taken 11 months to construct. Walter worked with Donald Clark on a territorial inheritance decree, a legal instrument recognized under Moon Law that allowed an alpha patriarch to transfer territorial authority and pack land ownership directly to a designated heir outside of the standard succession line. It was an old law, rarely used, originally designed to prevent corrupt alpha successors from dismantling pack structure. It had not been invoked in the Iron Veil pack in over 60 years. The decree named Tiffany Hanson as the lawful territorial inheritor of the Iron Veil pack, sacred lands, financial reserves, and ceremonial authority rights. It was sealed 3 weeks before Walter's death, and it was designed to activate at the most legally potent moment possible, the public reading of the estate during the Alpha Patriarch's sacred funeral rite. Walter had thought of everything, was including the fact that having the entire pack present as witnesses to the activation would make the transfer essentially uncontestable. He died 11 days later, from the illness he had been managing quietly for 6 months. He had told almost no one how serious it was. He had used the time he had with characteristic efficiency. Tiffany was with him at the end. She held his hand and thanked him for the only unconditional protection she had received in 3 years of belonging to his family. He told her to stand straight at the funeral. She promised she would. She kept that promise with everything in her. Donald Clark was not a dramatic man. He had been the Dillon family's legal counsel for 31 years, and in that time he had learned that law, when constructed with precision, did not need theatrics. It simply needed to be correct. A document that was legally airtight did not care how loudly someone objected to it. It simply held. He was lean, silver-haired, in his late 50s, with a way of speaking stripped of every unnecessary word. When he spoke, you understood immediately that what he was saying was the whole sentence, and nothing in it was filler. He had brought Albert Doran into the arrangement 6 months after the initial decree was drafted. Albert was younger, sharper in courtroom settings, and specifically experienced in pack divorce law and mate bond dissolution proceedings. While Donald held the territorial architecture together, Albert had been quietly preparing the legal framework for what would need to happen after the decree activated. Moon law on mate bond dissolution was, like most ancient law, both precise and ruthless. A matabond carried legal and territorial protections for both parties. Dissolution required formal grounds, betrayal of pack honor, financial deception, public humiliation of the Luna, or documented misuse of pack authority. Any one of these grounds, properly evidenced, was sufficient. Tiffany had evidence of all 4. Albert reviewed her documentation 3 months before the funeral. He went through it with the thoroughness of a man who wanted to be absolutely certain before he said what he was about to say. Then he set the folder down, folded his hands on the table, and looked at her steadily. "In all my years practicing pack law," he said, "I have never seen a more complete evidentiary record assembled by a non-legal professional. If this is presented correctly and in the right sequence, there is no outcome available to your husband except the one you choose to allow." Tiffany absorbed this without visible reaction. "And Karen's child?" she asked. "The pregnancy?" "Legally irrelevant to territorial claim," Albert said. "Under Moon law, a child born outside the mat bond has no automatic territorial inheritance rights, or any claim would require elder council ratification and Luna authorization. So Eric cannot pass the territory to that child. Not without your agreement." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "And if he simply refuses to acknowledge the decree?" "Then the Elder Council enforces it," Albert replied. "That is what Elder Councils exist for. Walter was careful to ensure 3 sitting elders knew the decree existed before his death. They cannot unknow it, and they are bound by their oath to moon law above their loyalty to any individual alpha." There was something almost mathematical about the way Walter had constructed this. Every exit had been closed before the room was entered. Every objection had been anticipated and answered. It was the legal equivalent of a man who had played chess several moves ahead of everyone else, and then quietly laid down his pieces and waited. Tiffany found herself grateful, not for the first time, that Walter had cared, and quietly furious, not for the first time, that his son had made it necessary. The funeral of Alpha Walter Dillon began at moonrise on the 3rd day following his death, as tradition required. The great hall of the Iron Vale Pack was ancient, its walls built from the same stone as the original pack settlement, was its ceiling supported by carved timber beams that bore the marks of every Alpha generation since the founding. Torchlight moved against those walls in a way that made the carvings seem to breathe. The scent of ceremonial herbs, pine resin, dried elderflower, the faint sharpness of iron, filled the space in a way that was simultaneously solemn and deeply alive. The pack numbered nearly 300, and almost all of them were present. Warriors stood along the walls. Elders occupied the ceremonial seats. The merchant families, the council members, the healers, the young wolves who had grown up with Walter as the only Alpha Patriarch they had ever known. All of them filled the space with a density of grief that was as close to physical as grief ever gets. Tiffany had arrived early. She stood beside the wolf-crested coffin in her ceremonial black, the silver moon pendant at her throat, catching the torchlight with every slow, steady breath she took. No, she had not slept well. She had not eaten much. But she had dressed with absolute intention, every detail considered, because Walter had asked her to stand straight, and standing straight meant looking like herself, the fullest, most composed version of herself, on this night when everything was going to change. The elders watched her with expressions she had learned to read over 3 years. Elder Mara, the oldest and most senior of the 5-member council, caught her eye once across the hall. She did not smile. She gave a single slow nod, the kind that carries entire conversations in it. Tiffany returned the nod and looked back at the coffin. Eric arrived 40 minutes into the gathering. The hall did not go immediately silent when the doors opened. It took a few seconds for the ripple to travel, person by person, from the entrance to every corner of the room. But it got there. It always got there. To Eric's entrance was exactly what she had anticipated. He had dressed for authority. The ceremonial armor, the fur cloak, the studied expression of a man who understood this moment was his political stage as much as his personal grief. He moved through the crowd with the confidence of someone who expects it to part. And the crowd did part, because crowds almost always do for the person who expects it most loudly. Karen was at his side. The red gown was a choice that had required thought, and Tiffany recognized it as such. No one wears red to a funeral by accident. It was either complete ignorance or complete deliberateness, and Karen Preston had never struck her as ignorant. The whispers broke like a wave through the hall. 300 wolves processed the scene in approximately 4 seconds. Alpha, pregnant woman, red dress, the Luna standing beside the coffin in black, the hand on the stomach, the deliberate positioning. Some people gasped. Some simply stared. A few of the older warriors looked at the floor with the particular discomfort of people witnessing something they feel they should stop, but lack the authority to address. Eric looked across the hall at Tiffany. His expression shifted for just a moment. Not into guilt, but into something more calculated. He was watching to see if she would react. He was waiting for tears, or anger, or the kind of public unraveling that would make him seem justified by comparison. She gave him nothing. Her gaze moved from the coffin to Eric's face, held there for exactly 2 seconds, and then returned to the coffin. Her hands remained folded. Her posture did not change. Her expression did not flicker. It was, several people would later say, the most unsettling thing they had ever witnessed at a pack gathering, not because anything violent happened, but because of the quality of her calm. It was the calm of someone who already knows the ending. "She's in shock," someone near the back murmured. "She's devastated," another voice agreed. They were both wrong. Eric moved to the other side of the coffin, Karen still at his side, and placed his free hand briefly on the lid. It was a gesture meant to communicate grief. It communicated to those watching carefully, primarily that he had practiced it. The funeral rite continued. Elders spoke, warriors offered remembrance. The ceremonial horn was sounded 3 times, or the pack bowed together. The sacred words were recited in the old language, the one that predated written records and carried in its rhythms the actual weight of tradition. Tiffany spoke when it was her turn, quietly, carefully, honestly. She talked about Walter's patience. She talked about his dignity. She said that he had taught her, in ways she hadn't anticipated, that the most important things a person could build were unseen by everyone except the people who most needed them. Or she did not look at Eric when she said this. She did not need to. Several elders exchanged glances. The funeral moved, as it always did, toward the reading of the estate. What most people in that hall did not know was that the 2 weeks preceding this night had been among the most productive of Tiffany's life. Not in a visible way. Not in a way that anyone watching her would have identified as preparation. She had moved through those weeks with the same quiet routine she always maintained, attending to pack domestic affairs, meeting with the healers, visiting the elders, going about the ordinary work of a Luna as though nothing unusual was occurring. But in the evenings, after the main hall had gone quiet, and Eric was occupied with whatever occupied him, she had stopped asking. She had been in communication with Albert Doran, or the documentation she had been maintaining for 18 months had been formally organized, legally notarized, and submitted in 3 sealed packages, one to Albert, one to Donald Clark, and one to Elder Mara, with the instructions that the council copy was to be opened only at the estate reading. The financial records were thorough. 7 unauthorized withdrawals, with dates, amounts, and the forged signatures documented against original signed documents from Tiffany's personal files. More total, 460,000 units from the Pack Reserve Trust. All of it directed through the Draven trading account, Karen's family's business. This was not merely marital betrayal. Under Moon law, this was financial corruption of Pack resources, which carried criminal implications under the Pack's legal structure entirely separate from the Matbond dissolution. Albert organized the documentation into distinct legal categories. The Matbond dissolution grounds, as including public humiliation of the Luna and abandonment of the Matbond's protective obligations. The financial corruption grounds, including fraudulent use of the Luna's signature and misappropriation of Pack reserves. And the territorial claim grounds, the sealed decree prepared by Walter and Donald Clark. Each category was watertight on its own. Together, they were, in Albert's words, architectural. Karen, for her part, was having a considerably less comfortable evening than she had anticipated. She had imagined the funeral differently. She had imagined the Pack watching Tiffany crumble, and watching herself step into the space that crumbling left behind. She had imagined the elders being uncomfortable but ultimately deferring to Eric's authority. She had imagined a clean transition, grief, then reshuffling, then her child at the center of the Pack's future. What she had not imagined was Tiffany's composure. Look, there is something about a woman who does not react the way you expected that feels, inexplicably, like a threat. Karen had found herself watching Tiffany more than she meant to throughout the ceremony. The way the elder women spoke to her with genuine warmth, The way certain senior warriors inclined their heads toward her with a respect that was clearly habitual rather than performative. The way Elder Mara had given her that slow nod. "Why is everyone treating her like she's in charge?" Karen murmured to Eric during a quiet moment. "She's the Luna," Eric replied, mildly distracted. "That's just protocol." Karen looked back at Tiffany one more time and said nothing further, but the discomfort had settled somewhere behind her sternum and declined to leave. Moonlaw was not metaphor. This was something outsiders to pack culture frequently misunderstood, and something that even some wolves within packs failed to treat with the seriousness it warranted. It sounded ceremonial. It sounded ancient in the way that ancient things sometimes sound quaint. But Moon Law was, in practical terms, the foundational legal code by which pack territories, resources, bloodlines, and authority were governed. It predated written records. It had been refined through centuries of dispute and resolution, and it held not because of tradition alone, but because the elder councils who enforced it had absolute authority to do so, independent of whoever held the alpha title. This was intentional. Walter Dillon had explained it to Tiffany once, with characteristic patience, when she had asked why the pack needed both an alpha and an elder council. "Because absolute authority is a trap," he had said, "or it does not matter how good a person is. When there is no structure above them, they eventually make decisions that serve themselves. The council is the structure. The law is the ceiling. No alpha, in the end, is above it." He paused, and then added something she had not fully understood at the time. "One day, that will matter to you specifically. I need you to remember it when it does." She had remembered. The territorial inheritance decree that Walter and Donald Clark constructed was built entirely within the framework of Moon Law, specifically the provision that allowed a sitting Alpha Patriarch to designate a territorial inheritor outside of standard bloodline succession when there was documented evidence of pack resource corruption by the standard heir. It was not a loophole. It was a structural safeguard. Donald Clark had spent 11 months ensuring that every procedural requirement was met. 3 independent witnesses to the document signing, formal filing with the Elder Council, a sealed secondary copy held by a neutral legal repository outside the pack's direct jurisdiction, notarized acknowledgement from Elder Mara that the council had received notice of the decree's existence. Everything was in order. The reading of the estate, which occurred at the conclusion of every sacred funeral rite, would be the legal activation point. At the moment, Donald Clark opened Walter's sealed final decree in front of the assembled pack. The territorial transfer would become not pending, but enacted. Irrevocable, witnessed, binding. And there was nothing Eric could do about it, except face the consequences of what he had built. Eric Hanson's confidence on the night of the funeral was at its most complete. He had spent the 2 weeks following his father's death carefully positioning himself for what came next. He had met with senior warriors to confirm their loyalty. He had begun preliminary conversations with 3 neighboring pack representatives about territorial agreements he intended to negotiate from a newly strengthened position. He had even begun considering which of his father's study furnishings he wanted to keep. He had not, in any of this activity, spent any meaningful time thinking about Tiffany. This was the fundamental miscalculation. It is a peculiarity of entitled thinking that the people most likely to underestimate their opponents are those who never genuinely believed their opponents were capable of opposition. Eric had filed Tiffany under a category in his mind, something like quiet and manageable, and had not updated that file in 3 years. The document she had been building, the conversations with Albert Doran, or the meetings with Donald Clark, the relationship she had carefully maintained with the Elder Council, all of it had occurred, in its entirety, outside the narrow field of his attention. He had been busy with important things. He had not noticed that while he was being busy, she was being thorough. The evening before the funeral, he made an attempt, his first in weeks, at something resembling conversation with her. She was in the Eastern Hall, reviewing the ceremonial arrangements, and he came in with his hands in his pockets and the slightly uncomfortable expression of a man who knows he should say something but has not decided what. "Tomorrow will be significant for the pack," he started. "Yes," she said, without looking up. "There will be a lot of eyes on us." "There will be a lot of eyes on the ceremony," she corrected mildly. "As there should be." He was quiet for a moment, watching her work. "I know this hasn't been easy," he said. It cost him something to say it. And she found the cost insufficient. "Everything will be addressed appropriately," she replied. "Tomorrow." He took this as reassurance. He interpreted "everything will be addressed appropriately" to mean that she intended to behave herself in public and allow the night to pass without incident. He went to bed feeling more settled than he had in days. She had meant it entirely literally. Everything would, in fact, be addressed appropriately tomorrow. Or the misunderstanding was perhaps the most clarifying thing about him. He had heard the words she said and filled them with the meaning he preferred, because he had never once considered that her meaning and his preference might be different things. She had not corrected him. She simply turned back to the ceremonial arrangements, placed the last branch of dried elderflower at the head of where the coffin would rest, and said good night. The reading of the estate came at the end of the funeral rite, after the ceremonial horn had been sounded for the final time, and the pack had observed the ritual silence in honor of the passing Alpha. Donald Clark rose from the elders' section. He was not a large man, and he made no attempt to command the room through presence. He commanded it through stillness, by standing at the center of the hall and waiting with complete patience for the room to come to him. It always did, but he carried a carved ironwood case, the kind used specifically for sealed legal documents under Moon law. It was distinctive. Every wolf in that hall over the age of 30 recognized what that case meant. The elders sat forward slightly. Several senior warriors exchanged glances. Elder Mara folded her hands and waited. "I am authorized to read the final sealed decree of Alpha Patriarch Walter Dillon of the Iron Veil Pack," Donald said. "In the presence of the assembled pack, according to the requirements of Moon Law's estate provision, this decree carries the signatures of the Patriarch, 3 independent witnesses, and the formal acknowledgement of the Elder Council. By the law and tradition of this pack, it is now enacted." The room was completely, absolutely silent. Eric sat straighter. Karen, seated slightly behind him, went very still. Tiffany stood at the end of the row nearest the coffin. She did not move. Donald opened the case. He removed the document, ancient cream parchment with Walter's seal in deep burgundy wax. He unfolded it with the precision of a man who had handled legal instruments for 31 years, and treated every one of them as though it deserved full respect. "The sacred lands of the Iron Veil Pack," Donald read, his voice unhurried and entirely clear. "Including all territorial acres within the established boundary markings, the financial reserves held in the Dillon Pack Trust, the ceremonial authority rights of the bloodline, and the leadership oversight of all matters pertaining to pack resource management are hereby transferred in full to Tiffany Hanson of the Ashbourne bloodline, currently serving as Luna of the Iron Veil Pack, under the provisions of Moon Law's Emergency Territorial Inheritance Clause." He looked up briefly, then continued, "This transfer is effective upon the public reading of this decree before the assembled pack. It is irrevocable. It supersedes all standard succession claims. It is supported by documented evidence of pack resource corruption filed separately with the Elder Council, copies of which have been held in sealed record since the 15th of last month. The Elder Council is instructed to enforce this decree in accordance with their oath and the full weight of Moon law." He folded the document. He looked directly at Eric. "The estate of Alpha Patriarch Walter Dillon is now fully executed." The hall was, for approximately 4 seconds, completely without sound. Then it broke. Not in chaos, in the particular, controlled way that a room breaks when 300 people simultaneously process something enormous and understand it is real. But voices rose and fell. Warriors shifted. Several elders rose to their feet. 2 younger pack members near the back actually laughed, then smothered it, then looked at each other and acknowledged silently that it had been impossible not to. Eric stood. His expression went through several things very quickly: confusion, then disbelief, then the dawning, visceral comprehension that comes when a person realizes the ground beneath them is not where they thought it was. That's... He stopped. He tried again. "My father would not..." "Your father did," Donald said simply. 3 weeks before his death, with full cognitive capacity, in the presence of 3 witnesses, and with the formal acknowledgement of the Elder Council, the documentation of grounds, financial corruption of the Pack Reserve Trust, has been held in sealed record and will be formally presented to you in a legal proceeding within the next 10 days. Karen had gone the color of old ash. Her hand dropped from her stomach. Something in her face shifted. The confidence she had worn all evening receding with sudden speed, leaving behind an expression that was younger and considerably less certain. And then something happened that no one had anticipated. The pack crest on the coffin, the carved iron wolf head at the center of the lid, caught the torchlight at an angle that sent a sharp reflection directly across Tiffany's face, illuminating her in a brief, a blazing arc of light that lasted only a second, but felt considerably longer. Elder Mara rose to her feet. One by one, the other 4 elders followed. And then, in the way that things happen when 300 people are watching the same thing at exactly the same moment, several of the senior warriors near the front took a step back, and then they bowed. Not a small incline of the head, a full, formal bow, the kind reserved for the legitimate territorial authority of the pack. It rippled through the hall like a tide. Tiffany Hanson stood in the torchlight, composed and unmoving, and let the truth of the moment settle around her like something that had always been waiting to happen. She had not raised her voice once all evening. She had not needed to. The days that followed the funeral were not quiet, but they were orderly, which was something far more valuable. But Albert Doran filed the formal Matbond dissolution proceedings on the morning after the estate reading. The grounds were multiple and well documented. Eric's legal team filed 2 preliminary objections, both of which were dismissed by the Elder Council within 48 hours. The financial corruption case took slightly longer, 10 days as Donald Clark had promised. But when the evidence was formally presented, it was not a close proceeding. The records Tiffany had maintained over 18 months were organized, cross-referenced, and exactly as complete as Albert had described them. The 7 unauthorized withdrawals were documented in full. The connection to the Draven trading account was established through bank correspondence that Eric had, it turned out, preserved in his own files, without apparently considering that those files might one day be reviewed. This, Albert said later, or with the closest thing to human he typically expressed, had been particularly helpful. Eric Hansen was stripped of his alpha title by Elder Council, ruling on the 14th day following the funeral. It was not a dramatic ceremony. There was no public gathering, no ceremonial proceedings. Donald Clark delivered the formal notice. Eric accepted it in his study, alone, in a silence that had nothing of his usual confidence in it. The scar on his jaw, which had always given him an air of authority, looked different somehow in that quiet moment, not fierce, but simply a mark, like any other. He was permitted to remain in pack territory in a private capacity, stripped of all alpha authority, and removed from the financial trust entirely. He was required to repay, over a structured timeline, the 460,000 units misappropriated. He was not imprisoned. Moon Law's provisions stopped short of that for first-time offences without violent conduct. But he was, in every practical sense, no longer the man he had believed himself to be. Consequences, it turns out, are not always dramatic. Sometimes they simply settle into permanence without fanfare, and that is in many ways the most sobering version of them. Karen Preston left the pack territory on the 17th day. She did so without announcement and without confrontation, which surprised almost everyone except Tiffany, who had understood from fairly early that Karen's attachment had always been to the position rather than the person who held it. Without the position, the attachment had nothing to anchor to. She returned to the Draven territory, where her family's business affairs were now the subject of a formal financial audit connected to the pack corruption proceedings. The audit would take months. The outcome was not yet settled at the time of her departure. Her child, a son, born 4 months after the funeral, was acknowledged by Eric in a private capacity. Under Moon law, the boy carried no territorial claim to Ironvale, but he was Eric's son, and whatever that relationship would eventually hold was between them. Tiffany had no interest in standing between a father and his child, and said so clearly when asked. But that clarity was noted by the elders as evidence of the particular quality of judgment that Walter Dillon had always said she possessed. The pack adjusted. Packs do, when the structure is sound. And the structure Walter had built was sound. It just needed the right person at the center of it. Tiffany had always been more present in the daily life of the pack than Eric had been, in the ways that mattered: the morning meetings with the healers, the disputes between merchant families, the quarterly reviews of resource allocation, the quiet conversations with young wolves uncertain about their place, who needed someone to take their questions seriously. These things didn't change. They simply became official. 3 months after the funeral, Tiffany met with Albert Doran and Donald Clark together for the first time since the proceedings concluded. They sat in Walter's old study, which she had kept almost exactly as he left it, and because it felt right, and went through the final paperwork. "Everything is settled," Donald said, with his characteristic economy. "Everything," Albert confirmed. She thanked them both. Genuinely. She told them she understood that what they had done had been more than professional obligation, and she wanted that acknowledged. Albert straightened his documents with unnecessary precision, which was his way of accepting gratitude without quite knowing what to do with it. Donald simply nodded, at once in the way that Walter used to nod, and she understood exactly what it meant. The story of the romance, the real one, the one that came after all of this, began at a pack gathering 6 months later. His name was Cade Ellery. He was not from Ironvale originally. He had arrived as an independent packmate, seeking territorial affiliation, carrying credentials from 3 different packs, and a reputation for being exceptionally good at the kind of border negotiation work that most wolves found tedious and important in equal measure. Elder Mara had recommended him, which carried the weight of considerable institutional confidence. Tiffany met him at the Autumn Territorial Review, which she presided over in her capacity as Territorial Authority. He had been the last of 11 independent affiliation requests reviewed that day, but she had been tired in the particular way of someone who has been composed for a very long public period and is nearly at the end of it. He walked in, looked around the room with the calm curiosity of someone not trying to impress anyone, looked at her, and said, "You look like you have had a very long day. Would you prefer I come back another time?" She had been so surprised that she almost laughed. Almost. She had controlled it. But something in her face shifted, and he had seen it. And the look on his face in response was, she would think about it later that evening, more than once, simply kind. His affiliation request was approved. He was assigned border negotiation responsibilities, which suited him and suited the pack. He was not aggressive in his attention toward her. He was not performing. He came to the morning meetings when his work required it, spoke when he had something to say, and listened, actually listened, or the kind where you can tell because the response is relevant, when other people spoke. He brought her something to eat at the end of the Territorial Council's longest session in 6 months, which ran well past the evening meal and left most of the council hollow. He simply appeared at her elbow with a bowl of the kitchen's winter stew and set it down without comment, then returned to his own seat. Elder Mara watched this with an expression that, on her face, it was the closest thing to delighted. It was not a rushed romance. It was not the breathless, consuming kind that announces itself in storms. It was the kind that builds the way good things build, gradually, without pressure, from the accumulation of small moments in which two people consistently choose to show up as their actual selves. He was honest with her. She was honest with him. He asked her opinion and meant the question. She told him difficult things without softening them past recognition, and he received difficult things without flinching. "You are different than I expected," he told her once, on a morning walk along the eastern ridge. Not accusatory, just observing. "What did you expect?" she asked. "Someone more armored," he said. "Given the history." She thought about this for a moment. "I had armor," she said finally. "It just looked like composure from the outside. I think the difference is that armor is defensive, and composure it's more like knowing that you're going to be all right either way. So you do not need to guard against the outcome. You can just be present for whatever happens." He was quiet for a while after that, looking out over the ridge. "That is one of the most sensible things I have ever heard anyone say," he said at last. She looked at him. "I had a good teacher," she said. She was thinking of Walter, but she was also, she realized, thinking of herself, of the version of herself who had stood beside a coffin in ceremonial black and held still while the world rearranged itself around the truth she had quietly, carefully built. The first time he kissed her, it was in the late autumn at the edge of the ceremonial grounds, after a public event had ended, and the last of the pack had drifted home and left the torches burning low. It was not tentative. It was not uncertain. It was the kiss of someone who had thought about it long enough to know they meant it, and who understood that meaning something was the only reason to do it at all. She kissed him back with the fullness of someone who had learned, through a very particular kind of difficulty, that love given with conditions is not love at all, and that love received with genuine attention is one of the rarest and most worthwhile things available to a person. Oh, she had earned this, not as a prize, not as a reward, simply as the natural outcome of having been, through everything, entirely herself. The pack knew, of course. Packs always know. There were smiles at morning meetings that had not been there before. Elder Mara said nothing, but moved the agenda along with the brisk satisfaction of someone whose endorsement had proven well placed. But even some of the warriors who had once inclined their heads toward Eric with automatic deference now inclined them toward Tiffany with something that looked and felt like genuine respect. That was the difference, she thought, and it was not a small one. Respect earned through genuine conduct is an entirely different weight than deference given out of position. One is freely offered, the other is extracted, and you can always tell if you pay attention which kind fills the room. The Iron Veil Pack entered the following year with its financial reserves intact, its territorial boundaries stable, its elder council in full function, and its territorial authority held by a woman who had stood in the torchlight beside a wolf-crested coffin and let truth do the work she had prepared it for. Walter Dillon would have been pleased. She was certain of that. Before you go, take a moment and reflect. Have you ever been underestimated simply because you chose dignity over noise? Have you ever watched someone mistake your silence for surrender, only to discover that you were, in fact, the most prepared person in the room? If this story reached you in a place that mattered, if something in Tiffany's journey reflected something in your own, then your support means everything to us. Please subscribe to the channel, hit the like button, and drop a comment telling us where you are watching from. Your engagement does not just help the numbers, it helps stories like this find the people who genuinely need them. We see every comment, we read every message, and we are grateful for every one of you who chose to stay to the end. Now stay for the lessons, because this story was always about more than drama. The story was designed to entertain and to mean something. Here are the truths embedded in it. 1. Preparation is more powerful than reaction. As Tiffany did not win through a dramatic confrontation. She won because she had been quietly, precisely, building an evidentiary record for 18 months. In real life, this translates to documentation. Keeping records of financial irregularities, preserving communications, and maintaining a clear paper trail. Before any legal action, the preparation determines the outcome. Emotional reaction without evidence is almost always less effective than structured documentation with it. 2. The legal protection matters, and you deserve to understand it. Walter Dillon understood that good intentions without legal structure leave people vulnerable. The territorial decree was not an act of revenge. It was an act of protection, constructed through legitimate legal channels. In real life, people in difficult domestic or financial situations often do not seek legal counsel until the crisis has already occurred. Seeking legal guidance early, before the crisis, while there is still time to create structure, is one of the most protective things a person can do for themselves. 3. Silence is not submission. Composure is a strategy. Tiffany's composure throughout the funeral was misread by almost everyone as weakness or devastation. In reality, it was strategic restraint, the choice not to reveal what she knew until the legally optimal moment. In life, we are often pressured to respond immediately to provocation, to react visibly and loudly to injustice, but the most durable responses are sometimes those withheld until the timing creates maximum impact. Composure is not passive, it is active and deliberate. 4. Trust requires consistent behavior over time, not just declarations. Eric told Tiffany to manage her discomfort when she expressed concern about Karen. He told her nothing was wrong. He told her she was imagining things. These are patterns: dismissiveness, minimizing, redirecting legitimate concern back onto the person expressing it, that appear in real relationships and are worth recognizing. Trust is demonstrated through consistent, honest, accountable behavior over time. It cannot be declared or demanded. When a partner consistently dismisses your concerns without addressing them, that pattern itself is information. 5. Financial literacy in relationships is not paranoia, it is protection. Though Eric was able to misappropriate PAC funds, in part because the people who should have been watching were not. In real life, financial abuse in relationships, unauthorized use of shared accounts, forged signatures, diversion of shared resources, is far more common than most people acknowledge. Understanding your own financial situation, maintaining access to your own accounts, and knowing what shared resources exist and how they are managed is not a lack of trust. It is basic self-protection. Not every person in a shared financial situation deserves to know what is in it and how it is being used. 6. The people who protect you quietly often matter more than those who protect you loudly. Walter Dillon said almost nothing publicly about what he was preparing. He did not announce his concern for Tiffany, did not make public statements about his son's conduct, did not create confrontation. He simply built the structure that would protect her when she needed it most. In life, or the people who show up with practical help, who ask the right questions, who quietly extend protection, who build something lasting rather than making noise, are often the most genuinely valuable relationships a person can have. 7. Genuine love is built on truth, not performance. The romance between Tiffany and Cade was deliberate in its pacing. It was not instant. It was not consuming or dramatic. It was built from consistent honesty, mutual respect, and the willingness to show up as actual, our unperformed selves. This is what lasting connection tends to look like. Not the version that announces itself with storms, but the version that accumulates quietly from the small choices people make to be truthful with each other. Love that begins with performance tends to require performance to maintain. Love that begins with honesty tends to sustain itself. In the end, this was never just a story about a funeral or a red dress or a public humiliation. It was a story about preparation and patience, about the kind of protection that gets built quietly over months by people who care enough to think several moves ahead, about the dignity of a woman who decided that her composure was worth more than anyone's satisfaction at watching her break. Tiffany Hanson did not win loudly. She won the way durable things are won, through structure, through truth, and through the consistent choice to remain, through every provocation, entirely herself. Eric Hansen faced consequences that were not punitive so much as they were architectural. He had built a structure of deceit, misuse, and contempt, and that structure held until it did not, and when it came apart exactly as thoroughly as he had built it. Karen Preston discovered that proximity to power and actual standing are not the same thing. That is perhaps the hardest lesson in the story, because it is the most quietly common one. Or many people find themselves close to something that looks like security and mistake the proximity for the thing itself. It never is. And Walter Dillon, who never appears alive in this story, is arguably its most active character. His decisions, made quietly, legally, and with complete clarity of purpose, protected the person who needed protecting, corrected the injustice he could see coming, and left behind something lasting. He is the reminder that legacy is not built in grand declarations. It is built in the quality of the choices you make when no one is watching, on behalf of people who deserve better than they are receiving. True power does not need to announce itself. It prepares, it endures, and when the moment arrives, it reveals the truth without ever raising its voice. Thank you for watching this story through to its end. Stories like this exist because you stay for them, and your presence, your likes, your comments, or your subscriptions makes it possible for us to keep telling them. We genuinely appreciate every single one of you. Subscribe to see how this unfolds and comment where you're watching from. I will love to say hello to you, just to know how far our story is going.